In 20 years of war in Afghanistan, the US lost 2,500 soldiers. In the war against Ukraine, Russia loses that many troops in just 2 days. Since the full-scale invasion began, Ukrainians have taken 730,000 Russian occupiers out of action, killed or wounded. And yet, despite these staggering numbers, Russia keeps fighting. Today, we'll dive into how the Russian Ministry of Defense manages to find so much infantry and what this means for the rest of the world. Throughout their history, the Russians have relied on one consistent tactic on the battlefield: the fire curtain. They bombard enemy positions with relentless artillery and airstrikes, then follow up with massive waves of soldiers and equipment. The result? Enormous losses that need to be replenished immediately. But how do you convince people to die in a war of aggression when every day brings news of friends and family being lost? 100 men were wiped out in just a few days. The Russian Ministry of Defense didn't think too hard about it and resorted to two approaches: financial incentives for volunteers and forced conscription of draftees, who were coerced into signing contracts and sent to fight in Ukraine. For signing up as a volunteer, Putin promised a one-time payment of up to $20,000 and up to $2,000 monthly for participating in combat. That's a hefty sum for Russians, whose average monthly salary is about $400. But, as usual, Putin couldn't resist screwing over his own people.
Нас здесь бросили как дебилов.
They dumped us here like idiots, and now we're just lying here. No one's coming to get us. We didn't get our salaries. Putin's one-time payment? Never saw it. The situation for conscripts looks even worse. They were treated like garbage. Just take a look at the conditions they had to endure in the winter. Last night, we had one stove for the whole tent. For a tent this big, it doesn't do shit. Half the guys are sick. This led to a total manpower collapse inside the country. Men began fleeing en masse to neighboring Georgia. You can't even get through. The border is jammed. This is the ultimate irony of fate. First, your country invades a part of Georgia, and then you flee there to avoid dying in another war. With mass mobilization in full swing, Russian training centers simply don't have the resources to properly train and equip the flood of new infantry. While some conscripts were getting drunk on buses en route to training centers, others were crammed into freight cars like cattle. Just take a look at the conditions inside. Bread's lying on the floor. That's the toilet. This is the kitchen where we cook, and that's the water barrel. And the funniest part? These future assault troops were handed rusty rifles from the Afghan war era before their training even began. They gave us rifles. This is fucking ridiculous. I'm just in total shock. With Russia recruiting 30,000 men every month, they simply don't have enough competent instructors at their training camps. In this video, officers are teaching someone to use a machine gun. The guy nearly killed everyone around him. Can you imagine something like this happening in the US Army? Maybe the grenade launcher training is better. Yeah, intuition tells us that's a hard no. How many times have you fired a grenade launcher? Once? Did you hit the target? No. After this high-quality training, the soldier was sent straight to the front. He tried firing the grenade launcher and almost killed his comrade with the backblast. This level of professionalism really sets the bar. Rock bottom. Now, let us show you two videos of how the unstoppable Russian army is being trained to fight for real. These clips might pleasantly surprise you. Here we have elite troops practicing how to mow the grass on a training field with shovels. But wait, there's more. Remember the American comedy Hot Shots? It seems the Russians didn't get the joke. Instead of teaching infantry how to fire AKs, they decided to teach them choreography. Hit that like button if you wish the Russians more of this quality training. Do you think these soldiers will be effectively deployed on the battlefield in the future? Let's hear it straight from them. They sent us to storm a concrete Ukrainian stronghold with rifles and shovels. Sounds like a nightmare, doesn't it? infantry sent on a frontal assault without equipment or artillery support. But for the Russians, this is par for the course. These men will soon be replaced by others. Why bother saving those they see as disposable? This is the grim reality of Russia's war machine. And it's not just their own citizens they're throwing away. The Russians have zero respect for the Geneva Convention or basic human rights. To make up for their staggering losses, they've resorted to forcibly conscripting Ukrainian citizens from occupied territories. When men refused to fight against their own country and hid in their homes, the Russians turned to outright terror. In one apartment building, the Russians caused a gas leak. They evacuated the women and children, but they took the men away. Sadly, this wasn't an isolated case. One man who couldn't escape to Ukrainian-controlled territory was forcibly conscripted into the Russian army. When he was sent to the front, he surrendered voluntarily and revealed heartbreaking details about his health. In August, I was diagnosed with lung cancer. I needed surgery, but I got a summons. They told me if I didn't show up, they would come after me. It's hard to imagine this man would have been an effective soldier. Yet, Russia plans to conscript another 300,000 Ukrainians from occupied territories. This blatant violation of international law seems to mean little to dictators, and history proves it. Another example? The mobilization of migrant workers from Central Asia. They're promised Russian citizenship in exchange for fighting, but very few live long enough to collect. Even with such harsh measures, 3 years into the longest war in the world, Russia still hasn't solved its manpower issues. The bodies run out faster than new recruits can arrive. To keep their offensive going, Russian commanders have turned to extreme measures, like mobilizing former prisoners. Hey guys, we're from Penal Colony 29. Right now we're in training, and soon we'll be heading to the front. Take Bakhmut, for example. The Wagner Group lost 20,000 prisoners in brutal battles to capture the city. For now, let's talk about why recruiting prisoners turned out to be a catastrophic mistake. Initially, the Russians used them in assaults, but many were killed. But those who survived? They started using drugs, killing their comrades, and looting. Here's what a former Russian drug dealer promised inmates while recruiting them in prison. Go and live it up. Rip gold teeth out of corpses. Take crosses. Loot whatever you want and bring it home. War's a 1 in a million chance. You might not make it back, but at least you'll have some fun. Some inmates took this opportunity to leave prison, but as soon as they reached training camps or the front lines, they abandoned their comrades, fled with their weapons, and disappeared into the wild. In theory, those who returned home should have turned over a new leaf and become heroes. In practice, far from it. They went back to robbing and killing. Now imagine hundreds of such individuals returning, and this time, they're armed. Do you think the Russians regret starting this war now? A rhetorical question, of course. Because of the constant manpower shortages on the front lines, Russia isn't just scouring its own population for reinforcements, it's looking abroad. According to Forbes, Russia has recruited fighters from at least 21 countries for its war in Ukraine. Most of them are poor people from the global south, coerced, kidnapped, or lured into fighting with false promises. This guy from Nepal found himself stuck. His visa expired. He had no money, and he ended up joining the Russian army. They promised him $2,000 a month, but of course they lied. In almost 2 months of service, I got paid $40. To save his life, he surrendered to the Ukrainians voluntarily. He's one of the lucky ones, making the right call and surviving. Before we dive in, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. The Russians have zero regard for these recruits and send them straight into the fire with no preparation. Here's how they explain missions to these men at the front lines. My English is shit. You know where the sun rises? Use that to navigate. Don't shoot over there. That's it. No compass, no commander, and they're left to freeze in trenches. Basic training? Forget it. When the Kremlin realized this kind of infantry was useless, they set up 37 private military companies, PMCs, to recruit professional killers. These are illegal formations designed for hybrid warfare and hostile takeovers in 34 countries. Of those, 25 PMCs are currently fighting in Ukraine. Each Russian PMC typically numbers no more than a battalion, around 1,000 fighters. They're better trained than the average Russian soldier and often equipped with heavy weaponry borrowed from the regular army. But no matter how many PMCs the Russians form, they can't cover the entire front line. So their leadership turned to allies for help. Unfortunately, this led to Kim Jong-un sending 13,000 North Korean soldiers to Russia, where they were integrated into Russian units. The Russians promised to pay these North Korean troops $2,000 a month, more than their yearly earnings back home. When the first Korean soldiers arrived at Russian training grounds, they were immediately taught the finer points of the world's second strongest army. And no, it wasn't tactics like you'd expect, it was profanity. The Russians even issued a manual to help their troops distinguish Koreans from Yakuts, Buryats, and Tuvans. Did it actually help? Doubtful. Meanwhile, the Koreans got access to the internet and dove straight into watching porn and streaming K-pop. Let's be real, that's way more entertaining than listening to Comrade Kim's speeches. Having lived in isolation, the Koreans struggled to adapt to life in Russia and began showing hostility toward the locals. Take this teacher, for example. She was sent to the Kursk region to teach North Korean troops Russian, but things quickly went south. On the very first night, they attacked her. I went to bed, and in the morning, I felt someone strangling me. The scariest part of this whole situation is that both the mercenaries and North Korean troops are gaining combat experience in the largest war of modern times, if they survive the meat grinder. These are people with no moral compass, willing to kill for money. When they return home, they'll continue their lives as criminals. In the case of North Korea, their forces could become a major threat to regional peace. Putin has essentially created the perfect environment to train future terrorists from all over the world. And it's not surprising, given Russia's active ties with groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, and even its push to have the Taliban removed from terrorist lists. History shows that dictators only understand one language: force. The most effective way to deal with them? Teach them a lesson they won't forget. That's why the White House approved the use of ATACMS missiles in the Kursk region. Shortly after, NATO allies joined the effort. The result? Democracy hit its mark. Ukraine's Air Force struck a key site in Kursk using Storm Shadow missiles, targeting an underground command center used by the Russian president. According to the Wall Street Journal, the attack injured a high-ranking North Korean general and 500 soldiers. Additionally, 18 Russian officers, including a lieutenant general, were eliminated. So, where do you think Russia will look for new soldiers next? Recruiting pirates? Offering contracts to aliens? Share your thoughts in the comments.